Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out. We are sitting. We have two people online, but we're sitting in the Lonsdale room rather than the Elwyn room, a smaller group, and so we'll have a little bit more of a research seminar vibe this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Ian Gadd, and with Betty Sushar. I'm co-convener of the Literature and Humanities group. I'm also, as Betty was for me, chair of the board. And so, given the circumstances at the moment, I have a statement that was issued on behalf of the board, which I'll read out before we start the talk. So the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution mourns the death of Her Majesty the Queen. This moment of great sadness, the institution expresses its heartfelt condolences to the Queen's family, the City of Bath, and the nation. The Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution deeply values its association with the royal family, which dates back, as many of you will know, to 1830. It has been fortunate to have had the formal patronage of two former monarchs, King William IV and Queen Victoria, during that time. Queen Elizabeth II has reigned for more than a third of the institution's existence, and her loss will be keenly felt by members. Over the coming days, we will join with others in Bath and across the country in saluting Her Majesty's many decades of service. And then finally, the institution will be closed next Monday on the day of the funeral, and the board has taken the decision to formally suspend its meetings during this time. The institution will otherwise remain open for talks, such as this evening, and for exhibitions through until after the funeral. So, with no further ado, I want to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris is a sociologist and writer based in London, and he's come up to us for the evening, for which we're very grateful. He's a senior lecturer at Leo Baeck College, an associate lecturer and honorary fellow at Birkbeck College, and he is the project director of the European Jewish Research Archive at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. He has a broad range of interests, which we will see on display this evening, including particular expertise in researching metal music scenes and the UK Jewish community, neither of which is the primary focus of tonight's talk. The author of, or co-author of 8 books, editor of several collections, many articles and reviews, career bridges, academia, and multiple other worlds, and his work has appeared in publications including The Guardian, New Humanist, Prospect, Haaretz, The Forward, New Statesman, and so on. His most recent book is The Babel Message, a love letter to language, published by Icon, and that underpins the.
I actually published a book since then.
Is this, what does it look like?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
What does it look like?
In collaboration with Rob Stockton.
I missed your pronunciation. Did you say love letter to the language or to language?
To language.
Thanks very much.
Our title tonight is War and Peace, brackets not that one, the message of Kinder Eggs. So, Keith, over to you.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in a city that I haven't been to since the 1990s, and it's still Georgian. I've managed to establish that. That hasn't changed. Also nice to be speaking at a royal linked institution. I think the only time I've ever done anything royal before was when Princess Margaret visited my school when I was 11 years old, and I acted in a short skit in front of her, and she looked like she would rather be anywhere else rather than there. But that was Princess Margaret. I'm sure if the Queen was there, she'd have pretended she was enjoying it. So tonight I'm going to talk about, it's not just a summary of my book, there's going to be stuff here that is not in my book. And I'm going to show how something that seems incredibly trivial can give us an insight or an inspiration for something that is anything but trivial. So, on that screen we have Kinder Surprise Egg. I have a real one to show you in a minute, not just yet. And Bruegel's depiction of the Tower of Babel. Here's another. Come on there. Here's another picture of the Tower of Babel. And on the left there is the quote from Genesis. There, and I haven't put the entire story there, although it's quite brief. I think most of us know what the Tower of Babel story is. But the reason why God, this quote I put in there is why God destroys the Tower of Babel, and how he destroys the Tower of Babel. So humanity gets together to try and build a tower to the heavens. And God says, if it's one people with one language for all, because the builders all spoke the same language, if this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so they shall not understand each other's speech. So that's how God indirectly prevents the Tower of Babel being built, by making sure that they can't understand each other. And the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi glosses that by saying, one asks for a brick and the other brings him lime. The former therefore attacks him and splits open his brains. Great quote from Rashi there. Rashi, incidentally, probably the greatest Jewish commentator both on the Bible and on the Talmud. He was also a wine merchant who lived in the Rhine. Interesting fact there. That doesn't tie into anything. Just thought I'd give you that. The meaning of the story is quite clear, because it's partly theological, but it's also based on an assumption about what language is. That if we can understand each other, we can cooperate, and nothing is beyond us. If we can't understand each other, then we can't cooperate, and the end result is violence, or at the very least conflict. Now, I don't think that's true, or it doesn't have to be true. But before I tell you why I think that, here's another quote from Primo Levi. If anybody's read Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish writer who wrote some of the most haunting works about his time in Auschwitz during the Second World War. And he works in the rubber plant at Buna, which was part of the Birkenau adjunct to Auschwitz. And he says, the confusion of languages is a fundamental component of the manner of living here. One is surrounded by a perpetual Babel in which everyone shouts orders and threats in languages never heard before, and woe betide anyone who fails to grasp the meaning. No one has time here, no one has patience, no one listens to you. The Carbide Tower, which rises in the middle of Buna, and whose top is rarely visible in the fog, was built by us. Its bricks are called Zeigel, Greek, Tegula, Segli, Kameni, Matoni, Tegla, and they were cemented by hate and discord, like the Tower of Babel. And it is this that we call it, Babelturm, and in it we hate the insane dream of grandeur of our masters, their contempt for God and men for us men. And today, just as in the old fable, we all feel, and the Germans themselves feel, that a curse hangs over the insolent building based on the confusion of languages and erected in defiance of heaven like a stone oak. And this extraordinary piece of writing, probably even more extraordinary in the original Italian, he treats the obscenity of Auschwitz and Birkenau of Buna as being in defiance of Babel, that they are still trying to build the Tower of Babel, but no one can understand each other, which sort of compounds horror of it somehow. But is diversity of language necessarily a recipe for conflict? Well, there are certainly situations when you could say that is the case, at least partly. It would be wrong to call the war in Ukraine as simply a linguistic conflict. There's a lot more to it than that, but it is certainly true that the independent state of Ukraine, as it was formed in 1991, contained a very large proportion of Russian speakers towards the east of the country, whereas the west of the country was primarily Ukrainian speakers. And in 1994, when the separatist republics with help from the Russian state broke away, that was to attempt to create a zone separate from Ukrainian speakers. So language is certainly part of this conflict. And the corollary of the Babel message of Babel, as we have come to understand it, is that if we want to get on with each other, we need to find a way of speaking to each other. And I've been involved in work in interfaith dialogue that is inspired by people like Bohm, people like Ivan Illich, who say that to be able to make peace in the world, we have to talk. We have to get around the table. We have to have dialogue. And of course, we can only do that if we have a language in common. Now, I don't disagree with the value of that sort of stuff, but there are some reasons to question this assumption that getting together, becoming, living in peace with each other necessarily requires the same language. So here's a few points. A conflict between speakers of different languages is not necessarily a conflict between languages. The Second World War, no one calls it a conflict between German speakers and English, Russian, French, and so on speakers. They did speak different languages, but it wasn't interlinguistic jealousy that motivated that conflict. Maybe it made it a little harder to resolve, but really that wasn't the main thing at stake there. Also, we're living in a period of human history where languages are dying at an unprecedented rate. Of the 5,000 or so languages that are estimated to be around in the world today, there are estimates that say at the end of this century there are only like to be a few hundred. But would anyone say that the death of languages is making the world any safer? I don't think anybody would argue that. But also, and this comes partly from my own experience, I have been struck by the anger and conflict that is present online, particularly on social media. That's not a linguistic conflict. That is a conflict between people who see up close the nature of human beings that was previously hidden to them. At the moment, you could say we actually probably know too much about each other because people, when they're online, they're posting their innermost feelings. And that's difficult to handle. But that's not a language problem. That's a problem about knowing too much. So could we therefore say, could we make peace through not understanding each other? Right? That's the proposition that I have for you this evening. And I think you can. And I'll show you why. So this is where we get on to Kinder Surprise Eggs, and the talk becomes a little less heavy, a little less nightmarish, but do keep in mind that proposition that I said. Can we make peace by not understanding each other? So here is, I bought some Kinder Surprise Eggs tonight. I should say, and I will get one of you to open them soon, but I would say that there was a bit of an issue with these. Presumably you've all seen these in the past.
Betty is an American. I've never seen a privacy.
I was surprised. I didn't know.
So in America, these are banned in America, not specific. There's a myth that they were banned specifically. It's not true. In America, there is a rule that you cannot sell an edible object with something inedible inside. Right? That's why they're not there. So they created, Ferrero, who makes these, created something called a Kinder Joy, which you can also buy here, which has, instead of this light foil wrapper and a chocolate egg underneath, has hard plastic shell that you open in two halves, one half of which contains pretty vile chocolate paste, and the other half contains a toy, a self-assembly toy. So this is one of a batch of 50 Kinder Surprise Eggs that I was given last December when I turned 50 by my children to celebrate publication of my book, which came out in November last year. But there's a snag, which is earlier this year, I don't know if anyone's seen it, there was a massive product recall of all Kinder Surprise Eggs for sale in this country. And that's because the Kinder Eggs that you buy in this country, sale in this country, come from a plant in a place called Arles in Belgium, and there was a salmonella scare. So they recalled all of them. And actually, since then, it's been really, really difficult to find Kinder Surprise Eggs, although I rang the product support line and they said, yes, you can still buy them. But actually, it's quite difficult to get them now. So what I'm going to do is ask one of you to open it, but don't eat it unless you feel lucky. Let's do a couple.
Sitting as a chair of the board of directors here in liability, I'd rather you didn't eat it on time.
I have an interesting legal question about who was liable there,
Yeah.
because I've given a disclaimer here. It's not my, you know. So who wants to open one? Let's do a couple, one for each side.
Betty, you should. You've never.
There you go. You should probably wear gloves.
Did they give it to for the recall?
Yes, but I checked.
So
I've checked. This is who wants to do one of this though? There you go. Oh, it works. So you see there is a light foot. Everyone's being very polite.
Yeah.
Somebody open the egg. You don't have to. You don't have to. All right. So open it. You've got this very light foil outside, which means that there are Kinder Surprise collectors who who collect the foil, but it is an incredibly difficult thing to do to collect the foil to get it off. Okay.
and I didn't try to say it.
So then you have the chocolate, which is in two parts. Way. There you go. You're going to have to go for the
I didn't want us to open it in the room because
It's all over you, Betty.
I think I have to say, of this batch of 50, before the recall, people were eating them at talks I gave, and as far as I know, they're still all alive. So inside, that's yellow. That's a yellow capsule, right?
Yeah.
Why is it yellow?
yeah.
Because it's the yolk. I've done talks where people look blankly when I ask that question.
I think because it isn't chocolate, so you don't eat it.
Right.
No, it is the yolk, and you open it by you sort of you squeeze it, and you will find. There you go.
Right.
There you go. So you find some pieces of paper and a self-assembly toy. Now, I have to say, I don't care very much about the toy. What I care a lot about is one of those pieces of paper. One of them is assembly instructions. It's got a little cartoon with the assembly instructions. The other one has got the piece of paper. There you go.
Ian was going to look at the paper and I
Right.
mine.
So that's a piece of paper.
With young eyes, yes, I think.
In some of them, you might find it does occasionally happen that there are sometimes two pieces of paper. Oh, including in this one, interestingly. I'll explain in a minute. Just don't worry. I'll explain what's going on. So the main piece of paper contains a warning message, which reads in English, and I call this the message with a capital M in the book. Warning, read and keep, toy not suitable for children under 3 years, small parts might be swallowed or inhaled. And you can see the logic behind that. The toy there, as you can see it there, it's got some pretty small pieces, and kids under 3 years old might well put it in their mouths. And this message is part of what I call in the book, the manuscript. Now, and the manuscript contains messages in multiple languages, and I'll go through them a little bit later. In some, and you're very lucky because you've got one there, in some, you've got, you actually have two sets of warning messages. Another set that applies to a specific toy, right? So they have to give a specific warning. And there's something quite special about that. I'm quite excited that you've got that, because we'll talk a little bit later about why that extra piece of paper is interesting. That's not the extra piece of paper. That one is the extra piece of paper. Oh, you've got one there as well. We're doing very well this evening. I'll explain what's interesting about those in a minute. Anyway, so this is the manuscript, which for me is the most exciting thing about a Kinder Surprise Egg. Now, it's got the warning message in lots and lots of languages. And last year, when I wrote an article about this in the New European magazine, and they titled it, that I didn't make up the title, Kinder Eggs, the Rosetta Stone of our times. Now, question to hold in the back of your minds is this a Rosetta Stone? We all know what the Rosetta Stone is, right? Is this a generic Rosetta Stone? Hold that in the back of your mind. So, let's go back to the manuscript there. There are 37 languages in two sides of a 12 times 5 centimeter piece of paper, which is pretty amazing, really. And as you can see, they're very small. They're very small, these messages. And they are on side 1, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Bulgarian, Czech, Danish, German, Greek, English, Spanish, Estonian, Finnish, French, Croatian, Hungarian, Italian, Georgian, Kyrgyz, Lithuanian, Latvian, Macedonian, Dutch, Norwegian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, Kazakh, Slovak, Slovene, Albanian, Serbian, Swedish, Turkish, Ukrainian, Persian, Arabic, and Chinese. That's pretty impressive. If nothing else, it's a pretty impressive feat of typesetting, regardless of what else. It's also because these languages come in different sorts of scripts. Some of them, well, Arabic and Persian go from right to left. It's very, very complex art, if you like, of putting this together. But when you first look at it, you'd be forgiven for assuming, right, this is one message printed 37 times in 37 languages. It's actually much more complicated than that in a really interesting way. So, first of all, you have some messages that are what I call the lesser messages, which are not warning messages at all. So, what do you think KY is? What language do you think that is?
Kyrgyz.
That's Kyrgyz. That's it's actually a Turkic language of the former Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan, but it's written in Cyrillic script. Now, if you look at it, you can already see what sort of message do you think that is? There's some clues there.
It looks like an address or something.
It is an address, yeah,
And a telephone number.
telephone number and a date. So what this isn't a warning message at all. This is actually product manufacturing information, date of production, and the address of the importer, which is actually Ferrero Russia. And if you go next to it on the left, you see a message that says RUKZBY. What do you think that is?
Central Kazakhstan.
The BY thing probably trips you up, right? So that it should say Russian, Kazakh, and Belarusian. But I didn't put Belarusian on the list of languages there. That's quite interesting. Why? This is designed for people in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And in fact, this is product information. The first half of it is in Russian. The second half of it is in Kazakh. It's actually the same thing. It's product information, the same as the Kyrgyz. But unless you read a Cyrillic language, you can't really tell that. But what about Belarus? Now, Belarus is a really interesting as a place because it is one of the few places in the world where one of its official languages is endangered. So Russian and Belarusian are the two official languages of Belarus. But Belarus has essentially become a satellite state of Russia, led by a sort of working of Putin and Lukashenko. It was called for a long time Europe's last dictator. And Belarusian has been not exactly suppressed, but has been systematically treated as a lower status language. And in fact, people expressing
You say a lower case.
lower status.
Status.
So actually, it's quite interesting that if people remember, there were protests against the fixed Belarusian elections. I think it was either last year or earlier this year. No, it was last year. And the sort of the people resisting Lukashenko at the moment are often doing it through formatively using the Belarusian language. So the Belarusian language is not on here. The EAC there is the mark of the Euro-Asian Customs Union, which they have a set of regulations for product importing and safety and stuff like that. Below that, AR, what is that? It is Armenian, but it's quite interesting. First of all, this is going to get really geeky here. Two-letter codes, these two-letter codes, those are fixed by something called the International Standards Organization. And there are two kinds of two-letter codes. There are language two-letter codes, and there are country two-letter codes. AR in ISO language codes means Arabic. AR in ISO country codes is Argentina. So this is made up by Ferrero. What the language code should be is HY. And in fact, there's an Armenian warning message on that as well. This is the only language where there's both a lesser message and a proper message. But the difference is, and I might be able to show, and I will show you this later, is that the Armenian lesser message is in Armenian sentence case, whereas the Armenian warning message is in Armenian uppercase. So it looks completely different. This one, by the way, for my book, I transcribed all of these messages in languages that I can't read. And this one was unbelievably difficult to do, as you can imagine, because a lot of the letters are very similar. Anyway, UA, you can probably guess what that is. Next thing.
Ukraine.
That's Ukrainian. If you didn't know, how could you tell that that was Ukrainian but not Russian? Does anyone know? There's an easy trick that makes you feel very in the know and that will impress your Ukrainian friends, even if you don't speak Ukrainian.
There a letter that they don't use.
There is. Can anyone guess what it is?
I.
Well done. It is. It's I with the dot on top. I with the dot on top is the mark of Ukraine, and you don't get that in Russia. Interesting, this is also product information, but the wording is entirely different from the Russian one. Make of that, this was of course created before the war. And I've actually been trying to find Kinder Surprise eggs from the latest possible batch to see how are Ferrero going to deal with all this stuff. Because Ferrero, whether there were all these countries that were pulling out of Russia, Ferrero said they've got a massive production facility in Russia, in Sochi, which is actually quite near the Crimea, and where the Olympics were held, Winter Olympics. And they said they issued this sort of gnomic statement saying they are scaling back their operations. And it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this comes across on the latest versions of the warning message sheet. And I find that really exciting because you can see the ripples of geopolitical conflict in a tiny little piece of paper. Anyway, so you thought this was just a piece of paper showing warning messages. It's a lot more complicated than that. And there are also inconsistencies and weirdness here as well. You also have two Chinese messages. Does anyone know the difference between one and the other? If you have a close look at it, you might be able to guess.
One's simplified.
That's true. That's right. Which one?
The one in the bottom.
One in the bottom. And you can see that if you look at the third and fourth and fifth characters along on the top line in the red, you'll see that particularly the fifth one along is like a blur of strokes, whereas the one below has got less strokes. Now, traditional Chinese characters are used in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. Simplified ones are used in the People's Republic of China and in Singapore for some reason. Simplified Chinese characters were developed after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, and the reasons for it were quite clear-cut. They were trying to improve mass literacy. Chinese characters are really, really tough. They're hard to learn, and they take an awful lot of practice to get right. If you can reduce at least some of the strokes, you could increase literacy, or at least that was the assumption of the Chinese government. And so I think it's somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 characters have been simplified. Some of them are saying they didn't actually need simplification. So that's how you can tell the difference between mainland China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macau. But it's exactly the same message. So on that piece of paper, you have 37 languages, but 35 are warning messages. But the warning messages are in 34 languages. Told you this was complicated. On top of this, when you look at them closely, which some of us might need to either take on or put on their glasses to actually do, you will see something interesting, that the warning messages are actually not the same. sometimes in really obvious ways, sometimes in less obvious ways. So we were talking French before. What's the difference between the French and the English one? You can see that up behind me.
It's not telling it frankly, telling you who is not suitable for.
That's right. It doesn't contain the middle sentence, toy not suitable for children under 3 years. In fact, only 7 of the 34 warning messages state the age thing. And there appear to be no connections between ones that do state the 3-year thing. So Spanish, Dutch, English, Arabic, and a couple of others. No connection between them, but somehow they've got that sentence in. Also, even weirder is, in fact, historically speaking, the age used to be 5 rather than 3. So how that changed, I'm not entirely sure. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are multiple other differences here in the way these things are typed. So if you look on that, the one to the right is the first block on the first side. And you can see they're all typeset in slightly different ways. And sometimes there are differences in wording in ways that are subtle and not so subtle. So if you look at the one marked DE there, you can see it says Warnhinweis in German, which means warning message, not just the word warning, and has an exclamation mark after it. So it has the word warning at the end of the sentence with an exclamation. Why? I don't know. If you look one up, you see the Danish one. The Danish one is a very restrained sort of way. It doesn't include any capital, it doesn't include the word warning in capitals. If you go 2 up, you will see Bulgarian, which has the first 3 words all in Bulgarian capital letters. It's a bit anarchic, in other words, and there are all sorts of other subtleties there as well that you have to spend a lot of time looking at to actually find them.
The Danish, I can read a bit of Danish, what that says is small parts can get stuck in your throat or your nose.
Indeed.
Rather than it can be swallowed or inhaled. So it's a lot
Right.
different.
Well, there are also questions there about meaning, about translation. And so we'll go back to the Rosetta Stone question in a second, in a minute. But the big shocker is that there are also mistakes on this as well. That as far as I'm concerned, nobody has ever pointed out before. So on the left, what language is that? Can you guess?
Estonian.
Estonian. There you go. It says ET. Can anyone work out what the mistake is? I mean, it's quite easy because I put the correct thing on the right. There are multiple mistakes. Okay, the mistakes are to do with what are called diacritics. Diacritics are things like accents or umlauts, that kind of stuff. So first of all, if you look on the second line to the right, there's a word called voivod, which means can. And you'll see the O is half bisected by a line. Now that creates a character that exists in no known language. I could so they somehow seem to have pierced the O with that. But also, if you look at in the next 2 lines, there's also lines which are called macrons of the letter O a number of times. One of which, and the word boy, is actually slightly wonky to the left. But here's the thing. Estonian does not use macrons. It is not an Estonian diacritic. What they use instead is what's called a tilde. Now, if you think of the word España on the end of that, you see that curvy line? That's a tilde. Well, Estonian has them on certain vowels. And you can see I've corrected it over there. Now, I've actually pointed this out to Ferrero, and every time that I buy a new Kinder Egg, I sort of look at it and I think, have they corrected it yet? And they have not corrected it yet at all. But it also tells us something really weird about how they created this. Now, if my job with Ferrero was to put together warning messages, here's how I would do it. I would go to translators in all these countries and say, send me in a Word document your message, and I'll give you details of what font to use, and then I would put them all together. This is not what they did here. What they've done here is something that is actually quite weird. They're actually working from image files. They are not working from these as actual letters. They are not actually typesetting it. They are actually superimposing one set of images on another. And they've simply got it wrong. But it's one of the most difficult ways you could imagine of making this error. They did, and why they do that, I don't know. But it's not the only mistake. And there's also something that's truly weird about what I'm going to show you next. So this is the Azerbaijani and the Armenian messages. Armenian is on the right. That's Armenian uppercase. And you can see how completely different it looks from Armenian lowercase that I showed you before. It's actually a stunningly beautiful script, really one of my favorites. And Azerbaijani is on the left, and they have something very weird in common. Can anyone notice what that is?
Quotation?
They're both in quotation marks, different quotation marks, but quotation marks. The one on the left is called a guillemot. If anyone reads French, I know some of the people there, you will sometimes see it used in French. You never use it in English, but it's basically just quote marks. Why on earth would you put a warning message in quote marks? I literally cannot think of a reason why you would do that. I mean, you could say maybe that is something that is a convention in Armenian and Azerbaijani, but it's very weird that it is those two languages, because these are two countries that have fought wars twice in the last 3 decades, including last year, right? And they're completely unrelated languages. Armenian is an Indo-European language, Azerbaijani is a Turkic language. It's a bit odd. Also, there's a bit of a red herring there in the Armenian one. You can see it ends with a colon. That's not a mistake. In Armenian, a colon is a full stop. So that's not a mistake. But that is, and there's another weird thing as well, because in Armenian, they actually do use the guillemot over the more times than they use the inverted commas. So another weird mystery. And there's also several mistakes in the Azerbaijani message. Can anyone have a guess what those are? That's a tough one. Okay. What they've done is to create several ligatures. Now, a ligature is where you put together 2 letters to create one. One famous one is in Danish, which has an A and an E that collided together. Sometimes you get it in French on words like sir. They sometimes put those together. It's called a ligature. And what they've done several times here is they've created ligatures between the backwards E, which is called a schwa. That just is an sound. The thing is, Azerbaijani doesn't have ligatures, right? So clearly what they've been doing, again, I could not reproduce this. I do not have the technical skills to reproduce it. Basically, what you would have to do is to have an image file of each single letter and then smash them together like that. Again, it's really, really hard to do. And you can see also there's plenty of space. They didn't even need the space. So this piece of paper is full of weird mysteries. Amongst other things, pointing these out is kind of empowering in the sense that multinational corporations are often seen as these vast, faceless bureaucracies crushing local distinctiveness. It's quite empowering to know that they make a complete cock-up of things, just in the same way that others do. It's also interesting that they make a cock-up of this, because they would probably not make a cock-up of the actual branding and packaging. It suggests a kind of contradiction there, because there's a bit of a problem with this whole warning message thing, because on the one hand, they have to create a product that says buy me, or at least says to children to nag their parents to buy them, because it's aimed at small children. So they've got to make it exciting and enticing and attractive. On the other hand, you've got to make sure that your clientele doesn't die. So the way they've dealt with it, and I doubt it's through a conscious decision, is by putting very little effort into the warning message sheet, or at least it looks like there's a lot of effort, but there's much less effort than you'd think, and putting it in this very hard to read document. So it kind of doesn't attract, so it sort of doesn't detract from the main thing of the product. And that leads to all sorts of oddities happening. But I think you can probably agree with me now and to say that this is not a Rosetta Stone, right? But the thing is, I don't think that the Rosetta Stone was a Rosetta Stone. I mean, yes, obviously the story of the Rosetta Stone is that through it, because it had Greek and two forms of Egyptian there, that was the key to unlocking Egyptian hieroglyphics in the early 19th century, which was an incredible achievement. It was the same message 3 times. But you cannot tell me that each of them was completely identical, because as anybody who's studied language and translation will tell you, the idea of a complete 100% translation is a myth. There's always a bit of a slippage. Sometimes it's incredibly subtle, and sometimes it's less subtle. So you saw in the Danish one that instead of saying swallowed or inhaled, it says taken in via the mouth. Get stuck in the mouth or the nose. Now, I don't know whether that's, I assume the word swallowed and inhaled exist in Danish, but does that mean that there is a fundamental sense? What are the nuances there in reading it? What are also the nuances for reading things where different things are in capital letters and other things aren't? What are the nuances of the German one having an exclamation mark, whereas the English doesn't? There are slippages here. Yes, go on.
I was going to say, typically, you want your warning message before you buy it, not after.
Well, here I've been slightly economical with the truth, because on the outer foil there is a warning message, but which is usually only in one language, and it is there. But they have one on the inside as well, partly because the foil is very, very delicate, so it often gets folded over onto itself. And also because, I'm assuming, because this is bought by, I'm speaking from personal experience when I had small children. I now have older children now, but when you'd give them that a few minute piece, right? They would tear it open, or you tear it open from them. So seeing it on the outside is probably not safe enough on its own. It's also the outside, you can only fit a limited number of languages. If you have the warning message in lots of languages, it's much easier in terms of importing and exporting and stuff, because these things do get exported. In London, I don't know what's the case in Bath, quite weird actually. Most of the Kinder Surprise eggs that you buy in local corner shops are actually imported from Poland or from Bulgaria. Why, I don't know. So on the outside, they have Polish warnings on, or in the case of Bulgarian, they have Bulgarian and Romanian, right? And because of that, that's why they have to have the inside thing, because they can make their way across all parts of the world. Why it is that local ethnic shops import their Kinder Surprise eggs, presumably from Polish cash and carries, I don't know. It doesn't really make much sense to me. So,
is it the case that Bulgarian and Estonian both share an alphabet?
Bulgarian and Romanian, I said.
Yes.
No, they don't. Romanian, they're also called, Bulgarian is Slavic, written in Cyrillic. Right. Romanian is a Romance language, written in Latin.
Thank you.
Anyway, the other thing that makes this not a Rosetta Stone is, well, one thing that I have to get asked in talks is, what was the first one? And I was quite interested in my researches of finding the very first one. But it turns out that it's an unanswerable question, because I found out, this is the geekiest thing I have ever seen, on this German website, Helmut Sammlerseiten. Germany is a hotbed of Kinder Surprise collectors. If you go to that website, they have scans of Kinder Surprise warning messages dating back to the late 1980s. The one on the right is the first they have recorded, but that doesn't make it the original. It's in German. It does mention the 3-year age, but as you can see, it doesn't. The wording is not actually the same as it is today, although it's quite similar. So I have been through this archive quite doggedly, and I found all sorts of interesting things, because you can actually trace the linguistic history of the world, at least for the last 30 years, through it. So you find what I call lost messages. So Azerbaijani used to be written in Cyrillic characters, but like some of the other Central Asian former Soviet countries that were written in Cyrillic during the Soviet period have changed back. Azerbaijani have changed it into a similar alphabet to Turkish, right? So that's what it used to look like between 2000 and 2004 in Cyrillic characters. Serbian's quite interesting. In fact, there's a whole bit in my book about how Ferrero reacted to the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, which was a bit of a nightmare for them. This whole post-communist market was opening up, but the countries were changing completely. What's interesting is Serbian is unique as far as I know. It's a language that can be written both in Cyrillic and both in Roman letters. And it's in the country, and there isn't any particular reason why one prefers one over the other. And it was in Cyrillic between 1996 and 2004. And I have a theory of why. Is because Croatian is very, very similar to Serbian. They're virtually the same language. But Croatian is never written in Cyrillic. It's written in Roman letters. So my guess is that they chose Cyrillic for the Serbian in order to differentiate itself more strongly from Croatian at a time when this was an extremely tense thing. Nowadays, the Serbian is also in Roman letters, but they're actually on opposite sides. Serbian is on side 2, Croatian is on side 1. But the most exciting thing is the thing that I've become really obsessed by is Moldovan, which was there between 1996 and 2014. Does anyone know anything about the Moldovan language?
Yes.
Well, the most interesting thing about the Moldovan language is a lot of people think it doesn't even exist.
Doesn't
Pardon?
exist.
It doesn't exist. A lot of people think the Moldovan language doesn't exist.
Oh, well.
Now, what is Moldova? Well, Moldova was part of the former Soviet Union from its inception, in the pre-war period, I think. And Moldova and Romania are closely linked, right? They're neighboring countries. But what happened was, during the Soviet period, both places had different histories. During the Soviet period, the prestige language, the way of advancement in society was Russian. You needed to know Russian. And Moldovan became the local language. And it started being written during the Soviet period in Cyrillic as well. When Moldova became independent in 1991, they switched to Roman letters. But that raised a question about what makes this different from Romanian. A lot of people say it's basically the same language with some very, very minor dialectical differences. And also the technical vocabulary in Moldovan contains more loan words from Russian. But really, Romanian and Moldovan are the same. But Ferrero were taking no chances. Between 1996 and 2014, they contain separate Moldovan and Romanian messages. And how do you deal with having to put in two messages in basically the same language without it looking like they're the same language? Because they don't want to offend anybody. Well, the way they did it was be completely rewriting it in Moldovan, but that could actually be Romanian. These days, if you look on there, you can see it. They've actually got one message that says RO-MO. So they're hedging their bets and saying it's the same language, but if you think it's Moldovan, go ahead and think it's Moldovan. But here's the exciting thing. Sometimes in the separate warning messages that you get for particular toys, Moldovan is still there. Can you now look at those second warning messages and see if Moldovan is still there?
Completely.
MO.
Yeah, I'm going to have to put this on in order to come
Right.
see it.
You sometimes still see it.
Yes. This is the only way I can do. Well, I don't know what I've done here.
This is telling you something, by the way, about the utility of these warning messages, that even when you want to read them closely, you can't.
Looking for MO.
Looking for MO.
ROMO.
Okay, that's the combined one.
PG, C, T, A, T, E. Okay, it's on the other side. This is riveting stuff.
Visiting stuff.
Old man looks up something. No.
Oh,
I'm getting that. There we go. ROMO.
oh, okay. How disappointing. Well, I've done quite a lot of these talks, and in one of them we did find Moldova. That was a very special moment. It's the holy grail for collectors of warning messages. Well, actually, just for me, actually. The other thing was there used to be a time when there were warning messages in there in Russian and Ukrainian. Now it's only product information, and this is what they used to look for. Now you can see below. Can you see why it's Ukrainian?
Yeah.
I with the dot there. You can see that was definitely Ukrainian. So this is a reminder of a separate time. Also, the word warning in Russian had an exclamation mark on it, and the Ukrainian didn't. So anyway, after my researches on this, I did what any sensible person would do, and I concluded that there weren't enough translations of the warning message into other languages. So I, over the last few years, started commissioning more and more and more. And this is what I have in my book. I call this liberating the message into more and more languages. So I have in my book, I have translations into ancient languages, including Middle Egyptian, which obviously I didn't do it myself, but actually wasn't too difficult. And in fact, and that's the same with the Sumerian translation, the message I've got as well, because actually when you think about it, why was writing originally developed? It was for bureaucratic reasons, right? The Babylonians didn't create writing in order to write the Epic of Gilgamesh. They created it in order to say, Fred owns this land, John owes him 2 bushels of barley. And also for warnings, particularly in Egyptian. In tombs, you have warnings. So actually, the sort of chilly bureaucratic language is possible in ancient languages. It wasn't too difficult. But I've done a lot of other translations as well. In the middle is what's called a constructed language or a conlang. The most famous conlang in the world, of course, is Esperanto. But there's a whole subculture of people who create languages. And this, the one in the middle, is called Ithkuil. And it's supposedly the most difficult language ever created. It's designed to be as specific as possible to remove ambiguity in the smallest amount of time possible. And the guy who created it, who did the translation for me, he's a cult figure apparently in Russia. He's called John Quijada, and he cannot speak it himself fluently. It has 96 noun cases, and it also has its writing system that I think looks fantastic. And in the process of commissioning these translations, I started to realize something, that actually I was starting to love them even though I didn't understand them. And in fact, it helped me that I didn't understand them, because the one below there, it's not a great scan, so I apologize for that, is in Tibetan script. But it's not Tibetan, it's a language called Dzongkha, which is the national language of Bhutan. And when I saw it, it just looks gorgeous. It's the most gorgeous writing system. I've got lots of translation into Indian languages as well. They just look beautiful on the page. And when you look at them, when you enjoy them, you start to forget that this is about saying something very, very mundane. The not understanding liberates you into appreciating what an achievement language actually is. And the extraordinary fact that people can do things that seem impossible to us. If you've ever been to China, I've been to Japan. You go down the street and there is writing everywhere. And I found myself when I journeyed there thinking, I mean, I do speak a bit of Chinese, but I can't read. I'm thinking, how is it that 1 billion people can read this and do this on an everyday basis? Let alone speaking it. It's not an easy language. It has a tonal system that is very, very hard for foreigners to get right. But people are doing it like it's no big deal. And when you don't understand, you can kind of appreciate the wonder of that much better than if you understood a bit of it. French, I speak some French, but it doesn't seem like a miracle to me. Whereas Chinese, which I can speak a bit but can't read, does seem like that kind of miracle. So that's the value of not understanding. But also in my book, I also explore the potential for sort of half-assed understanding. So after a while, I mean, I've translated, there are loads and loads of languages in this book. And I started to get jealous about people who were providing me with translations. The only languages I speak were ones for which there were already translations. So I said, I want to do my own, right? But I want to do it without actually having to spend months and months and months. Could I do it in a new language in an hour? Could I learn a language and translate it in an hour? By only learning just about enough to translate the message and nothing else. Basically, it's an experiment in half-assed linguistics. And I chose a particular language. Now, I'm going to show you the language I chose in just a second. One of the things I talk a lot about in the book is endangered languages. I set myself, one of the things I became really passionate about was commissioning translations from languages that are dying, including languages in the British Isles, like, that in the Channel Islands, there are versions of Norman French in Guernsey and Jersey, so I have translations into them. They're trying to revive their languages, or in Manx and Cornish. So I wanted to try and support these people by highlighting that sort of stuff. The endangered language I choose is a language called Monegasque. Now, Monegasque is the language of Monaco. Monaco being Monaco, though, virtually nobody in Monaco actually speaks it because most people in Monaco were not born in Monaco or have any history, but it is taught in schools. It's kind of a cross between Genoese and Occitan. And of course, I have Genoese and Occitan in the book. And so what I did is I found online a Monegasque dictionary and a Monegasque grammar and the French Wikipedia entry on Monegasque. And I thought, right, I'm going to do this. So in an hour and a half, I had it. And there it is. The one on above is what I did. Now, here's the thing. It looked plausible, doesn't it? Right? If you didn't know better, if you spoke some French and some Italian, some Spanish, maybe, you say, yeah, I could see how that could be attention. Yeah, I could see how that could be right. Juguetu for toy. You can see that in Spanish it's juguete. In French it's what's the word for toy? Jouet. You can see the relationship there. It looked plausible. The problem was, by the time that my book went to press, I couldn't find anybody to check it because there are so few people that speak it. Finally, though, after my book came out, I managed to get a correction from the person who translated a Tintin book into Monegasque as it's called. And there it is below. That's what it actually should look like. And it's not too bad for an hour and a half's work, or barely even an hour and a half's work. But if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know which one was the right one and which one, unless you speak Monegasque, and I can pretty much assume that nobody in this room does speak it. I'll tell you my favorite thing about this, incidentally. If you look at the correct one, the word attention, you can see that there is an odd diacritic on the U. It's like a line. Now, that diacritic is so rare that when she sent me this, she had to add it into a printout and then scan it and send it to me. This was one of the people responsible for the survival of the language. And they chose diacritics that are almost impossible to create on your computer. And I thought that was fabulous. I mean, if there was ever a sign of the wonderful madness of language, it's that, yes.
Would the diacritic appear, though, in the uppercase that you used?
Here's the problem.
Yeah.
One of the things that made it very, very difficult to do my translation was that the Monegasque grammar and dictionaries have been scanned and put online, but scanned really, really badly. So some of these diacritics were smudges. So I didn't really know what they'd actually be. So I thought, I'll just leave the diacritic out. But anyway, wouldn't it be great, though, if when you went to Monaco, they would have that there? And I say this in my book. I have a Kindereggs Ferrero company was born in the Piedmont region. Wouldn't it be a wonderful gesture if Piedmontese was in there as a nod to their founders? I got a translation. One of my favourite languages in the book is a minority Estonian language called Võro. He actually spoke at my book launch, the guy who runs the Võro Institute. And he sent me a translation for Võro Language Week. I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic in Estonia for Võro Language Week? They put Võro on those things. And I'm not actually joking. I'm not actually joking. I was in Cornwall a few weeks ago, and they're putting Cornish onto like just mundane announcements on the bus, posters on the bus. Very few people can read it, but it's a sign of normalizing it that says we exist. And why shouldn't Kinder Surprise Eggs be a version of that? I also got really into constructed languages in the book. Don't worry, I'm nearly finished. In the book, and I thought I'm going to create my own language. And I've read about constructing languages, and to do it well, it's an incredibly difficult task and a very time-consuming one. So I thought, why can't I do a half-assed language and create just enough to translate it into here? So this is my language. It's basically greatest hits of my favourite diacritics in Roman languages. I've also got in the Icelandic thorn that says there as well. So I've of course got the Estonian tilde there. I've got some macrons. I've got some Eastern European just sounds like getting Czech and things like that. But I actually did this properly. I know it looks like I made it up as I went along, which I did, but there's a logic to it. And the logic is I used a system that I knew from Hebrew. In Hebrew, and it's the same in Arabic, although I don't speak Arabic, in Semitic languages, most verbs and nouns, well, all verbs and nouns, and also some other parts of language as well, derive from roots. You have the triconsonantal root system. You have three consonants, and you build words around them by varying, adding additional letters, and by the vowels. And that's how I did it here. Everything here is based on a root that is vowel, consonant, vowel. And I chose that vowel, consonant, vowel at random. I used a random generator. So but I started with the word for warning, and the root there is ABN. So Altabash actually means be warned yourself. It's like a reflexive imperative, if such a thing can be said. So when I created this, I thought, well, this looks like a dog's breakfast. But I suddenly realized that using the rules of the grammar that I created, the tiny number of rules that I used for this, I could create new words, new parts of speech. And I promise you that this is not a setup. But I actually managed, using the same logic, to create the words for read this book, which is Iltigesh Zanigomo. Zanigomo means book. And it's basically constructed around the word. It basically says that which is read. Read that which is read, which is a book. So going back to the beginning again, what I hope I've done in the book is to say that not only is linguistic diversity nothing to be afraid of, but it actually frees us to understanding the wonder of what we all do every day without even thinking about it. And if there is a better way of making peace, I've yet to hear of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. Questions, comments for our speaker?
Yeah.
So the manufacturer of these is BRLSI, right?
Yeah.
I've got that with Italian.
They are Italian. They're a multinational corporation. Their corporate headquarters is in Luxembourg, but they have plants all around the world. They're enormous.
But you had Frankfurt, I think, up there.
I didn't know they're based in Frankfurt. I don't think they are. It's the corporate headquarters in Luxembourg. Their main centre, though, is in Alba, in Piedmont, in Italy. But the plant that manufactures Kinder Eggs.
So have you been in touch with the?
I have.
To tell them what you're doing?
They are famously secretive. Why are they secretive? They're secretive because they can be secretive, because they don't have shareholders, right?
They don't have shareholders, they're a private company.
They're a private company, they don't have shareholders. When I spoke to German Surprise Collect, they've created all these catalogues and things like that. Okay, there are two stories here. One story is my publisher, when I was negotiating my agent was negotiating the contract. I said from the very beginning, I'm going to want to print the warning message in this book. Now, that requires copyright permission, right? You can reprint the wording of these messages because that's called fair use quoting. That's fine. You can do the translations. That's fine. But to actually print the thing, you need permission technically. Now, this is a massive multinational corporation. How do you get that permission? Well, I've written books before where I've had images, and you go to the PR person, and they'll almost always say, yeah, fine, no problem, right? So I went to the PR for UK for Error, which is where you'd expect someone to go. And they weren't empowered to be able to make that decision. They said we needed to send the manuscript of the book to the legal team in Luxembourg before they could give permission. So we did that, and then 5 or 6 months later, they hadn't got back to us. We tried several times, they never got back to us. And eventually my publisher says, they really don't care. So they actually put it in, but not before they had to commission a legal read from a lawyer to see if there was any risk. So there's actually a few bits in the book that I had to tone down, which were a bit cheeky to Ferreira, not libelous, but just cheeky, because technically they could, we could get into trouble. So that's one issue. The other issue is obviously I would like to meet the person who puts this all together. And I thought the PR person said no. And then I tried to be a bit sneaky. I found the contact details of the UK public affairs manager for Ferreira, which is basically, and he's a guy called Richard Laming. And I looked him up on LinkedIn. What had he done before? Well, he'd run something called Federalist Society, something like that, which is a hardcore pro-European group. And I thought, if anybody is going to get this, he is going to get this. And of course, he said, no, I can't help you. So I tried, and no, none of them will talk to me. It's kind of like a benign neglect. They're not stopping me, but they're not doing it. I mean, my publisher said, we are happy to give you 50 copies of this book. Nothing, absolutely nothing. But that tells you something quite interesting, is that we are surrounded by stuff. I'm looking at that. We're surrounded by stuff, and we don't know how it, when I was looking at the panel before, we know how that came into being, right? But most of the things, we don't know who designed this, who designed this. Tracking it down is a virtually impossible task. All the decisions that went into making it, the creativity that went into it, conflicts make it, we know absolutely nothing of. All we see is the product of it. And actually trying to go beneath it is so difficult, and we virtually never do it, to put a face on it, to actually look at why those decisions are made. And I don't think that Ferrero are hiding any deep, dark secret about the warning message. I really don't. If they are hiding a deep, dark secret, it's the fact that it doesn't work. But, they have to do this for legal reasons. Well, I find that silence of them both maddening, but also really understandable. Because if you are the person who puts this together, do you really want your name to be known in a book? I don't know. Maybe I would. I don't know.
Two comments. First of all, I bought a vacuum cleaner recently, and it's got hundreds of different warning messages in there in different languages. Have you actually looked at other products and thought, I wonder what these warning messages are, if they're the same sort of thing?
So a lot of it is, I did look into this. There's more details of it in my book. A lot of this stuff is mandated legally in particular parts of the world. So in the European Economic Area, not the EU, has a set of standards, and if you conform to them, if you look on the sheet, you won't be able to see it. There's this CE. You see, once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. You see it in lots and lots of products. It conforms to their standards, and the standards are both in terms of the manufacturing, but they're also in terms of the documentation. So I went to the British Library and I managed to get the document that for warnings on toys. And there are lots, and there isn't just a document for that. They specify what sort of warnings and how they should be put together. But there's also a document with suggested translations, but they're not mandated translations. So I've looked at other products like this, and the wording they use is similar but not identical. So there is some creative freedom. And the one thing that legally I don't understand is what's the scope of that creative freedom and how that works. So this is all again, this is the secret world. There are pages and pages in this document about, for example, the specific warnings you need to put on children's paddling pools, right? It's all mandated there, and the translation of it is strongly suggested. But we see none of this. Unless you're involved in it, you don't even know that this stuff exists.
The other question is, it could be the fact that they got all these languages. It's just really them saying rather proudly, look, we sell this in all these different countries. It's a sort of advertising thing, don't you think?
Well, nobody's ever suggested that. It is impressive. It
just makes you think, gosh, this must be good. It's sold in Azerbaijan, it's sold in Russia.
Well, look, for a certain type of person, look, I saw this, I noticed this, and I noticed this when I used to buy them for my kids occasionally, right? But how typical am I as a consumer? I don't know. I think it's impressive. There are certain products that you see multiple things. If you buy anything from IKEA, they have loads and loads and loads of languages, although they try and minimize words and do as much as they can through cartoon. The other thing that's really interesting is sometimes you see certain products combine languages. So you often see one message for Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, which are closely related languages. And what they'll do is in the case of a word that you speak, you probably noticed this, they will put a word in brackets or an alternative. For Norwegian and Danish are very similar. Swedish is less similar. So they'll often put the Swedish word separately, just to combine that. You see that on Colgate toothpaste and on Kleenex tissues as well. Look out for it. Yeah.
How and why was your attention drawn to Kinder Surprise eggs?
Well, look, first of all, I'd say I don't like Kinder Surprise eggs. The chocolate's horrible. One of the most traumatic things I've ever done earlier this year, I was someone invited me onto a podcast where he bought all of the Kinder products he could find in his border shop, and we ate all of them. It was a horrible experience. That's the first thing. But it was when I was a parent with small kids that I saw this, and I'd never seen this before. I've always loved the look of languages, and I noticed that there were languages there that you never see on product packaging. Stuff like Armenian, you never see Armenian. Georgian, you never see Georgian, that sort of stuff. So that immediately brought it out. But this became a product in 2017. There was something called, doesn't exist anymore, sadly, the Boring Conference. It used to be held every year in London, where people would give talks on supposedly boring things that are actually interesting. So someone did something on gravel or elevators, that kind of stuff. And I pitched this, and they said, yes, come on and do it. And I got my first translations of the warning message there. So I got Cornish there, I got my son did Latin, And then the year after, 2018, the BBC commissioned a series of podcasts from the Boring Talks called the Boring Podcast. So I did one for the BBC on that. And then I thought, that's it. And then during lockdown, I started, for no real reason other than the fact that I wanted to reach out to people and do something that was happy and joyful at a very, very dark time. I started approaching people for translations, and I put them on my Facebook and Twitter account. And it snowballed. And I started thinking, okay, what else? I started looking for gaps. So, for example, I thought, well, we've got all the EU languages except for Maltese and Irish, so I want to get Maltese and Irish. And then I thought, well, we've got all the languages of Switzerland except for Romansh, so I'm going to get Romansh. Got all the languages of Luxembourg, but I haven't got Luxembourgish, so I got Luxembourgish. And it just snowballed. And then suddenly I thought, I've got a book here. And I also, it allowed me to make an argument that I wanted to make a long time. My two previous books were very dark. My previous book about it was 2019, was about anti-Semitism. The year before, I had a book published about denialism, things like Holocaust denial, climate change denial. And those books were about the dark side of human diversity, the difficulties that humans have in living alongside other sorts of people. But I wanted to do something that celebrated human diversity. And I think that the one kind of human diversity that you can celebrate with no qualification whatsoever is linguistic diversity. So it was the book emerged partly out of a search to do something joyful and celebration, because most of my career I haven't been doing stuff like that. It made me happy, and I think it's a book that is quite happy, but also with a message. But I would say that, wouldn't I?
So are you glad we have so many different languages, or would you like to be able to talk to people when you travel?
Well, I do like learning languages. One of the other things I did during lockdown is I learned Finnish. I say I learned Finnish. I can't speak Finnish fluently, but I always wanted to learn Finnish, so I did. And I got to the point where I could have a halting conversation with my teacher, and then I took a break for a month and forgot it all because I'm 50 and it's hard to learn languages past the age of about 15. And I can speak Hebrew pretty well, modern Hebrew pretty well. I can understand French and Spanish very well, but I can't speak them that well. So, but that's just a drop in the ocean. The greatest polyglots in the world may speak about 20 or 30 languages at most. And that's a drop in the ocean too, right? And so even under the worst case scenario for language death, there is never going to be a situation where everyone is going to speak all these different languages. So we have to live alongside languages that we will never speak. And my attitude is to say, let's celebrate that diversity and celebrate the fact that we will not understand it. Because I think there is an attitude, and I've probably sometimes been guilty about it in my life, that you see a language that you don't understand and it feels like a reproach. It feels like a frustration, particularly when you go to a country, where English isn't widely spoken and, it's difficult sometimes, right? But actually what I'm suggesting is a way to be at peace with that, is to love the fact that you can't understand it, right? To relate to it in that way, even if it makes, asking where the train station is more difficult. There's an upside to it as well. Yeah. So.
Sorry.
No, Martin, you first.
All these languages and things, given that I speak a few languages, I won't go into which one, the modern type languages, etc. But when you are using another nation's tongue, you are occluding listeners cannot receive the sense of what you say. So there is a little inevitable enmity, unhelpfulness in that mindset.
The thing is that's...
If you are not seeking, I will interrupt myself, and I apologize. If you are using other tongues, I like the word that the French use for language, tongue. If you are doing that, you are closing the ears of people that you consider effectively to be close. There is an act of enmity there. There is an act of non-communication, of exclusion.
So languages often, you're right, languages often be used to exclude. And sometimes written language, we were actually talking about this earlier, has been used, was an elite thing. Written language was by definition exclusive when it was first developed. I suppose what I'm stumbling towards in the argument I make in the book is to be a reorientation of our understanding of that, of sitting with the exclusion and then finding a way to enjoy that exclusion. One of the ways that you can do that is by recognizing that even when I'm speaking to you in English, I'm a native English speaker, you sound like you're a native English speaker. There is a gap between us. A language cannot completely close it. We sometimes delude ourselves into thinking that language can close that gap, but it only can do to a degree. And the more complex the argument we make, the more difficult it is to do that. Language is not a neutral mechanism to get that thought here into your head and vice versa. So it's there anyway. That slippage is there anyway. It's just, in a way, it's even more dangerous that we forget it when we're speaking the same language. So if we can come to terms with that slippage that's inherent in language itself, then we can come to terms with it, with its more extreme variants when we are speaking languages that we don't understand. It's quite a high level abstract argument, but, I hope using a very gimmicky case study for that, I hope to be able to show in practical terms how that can actually work. Did I get your point? So you wanted to?
Yeah, just to take on from that point, it's part of the experience I had. One time I was travelling back from Belfast to Bristol by coach, and an Asian woman came up and said, "Is this the coach to London?" Because there was like a short coach trip before you got on the ferry. And I dealt with her for the rest of the journey as far as Birmingham. And I realised that the only way I could actually speak to her was to actually simplify the words I use and not talk in sentences. So you choose the relevant words that she could understand.
Well, there is a kind of talking to foreigners language, and it's something that English speakers are notorious for, like talking loudly.
Yeah, it wasn't talking loudly. No, I need to get this message across, and we'll just have a conversation with her and just choose specific words rather than all joining words in between. So
there have been attempts to actually create a systematic way of doing that. There was a movement, kind of died a death, by the middle of the century, called Basic English, which had a minimal, it had a very limited vocabulary and a very limited grammar, and it was designed to be easily and quickly used. It's still occasionally used, sometimes in signs and things like that, and it seems to me that it's
sometimes occasionally used
in signage and in corporate. It's things like it is occasionally used, but yes. You can see the sense in it of creating a specific language to be used with people who don't understand the language very well. Certainly when I've been learning, I remember when I was learning Hebrew, there is a simplified Hebrew newspaper that was produced once a month, and I used to read that. That was quite helpful, right? And I know you get things like that in English as well for English learners. But most of the time, we're left to rely on our own devices. And it's a bit of a social minefield because you don't want to be seen as patronizing. But it takes a certain artfulness to be able to do that successfully in a way that preserves their dignity.
Yeah.
Because you're playing that game without the rules being known, because you don't know what she doesn't know, right? And people's knowledge of foreign languages is often really, really bizarre in the sense that you might know. When I learned modern Hebrew at the age of 29 in order I was on a program in Israel where I was being exposed to academic lectures in Hebrew, and I had to learn it very, very quickly to a very high standard to attend those lectures. So my academic vocabulary in modern Hebrew is extremely sophisticated. But I realized after a year spent in Israel, I genuinely realized I did not know the word for bicycle, right? People have those odd, you learn languages for odd things from odd ways, and you can't say to another person.
What was that word you said you didn't know?
Bicycle.
Bicycle, all right.
Yeah, it's another word for bicycle, right? But we are groping around in the dark. That person you were speaking to probably had areas where her knowledge of English was more sophisticated and areas where her knowledge of English was very, very limited. But you had no way of knowing them.
No, well, that's sort of how it came back. Hearing you say that, you spoke a sentence, and the look was what are you saying to me, like, you know. So you then sort of tried to just pick out certain words, and she was managing to say something back, like, no. So it was just a pleasure to get your message across and get the conversation going in that way. But the other thing I did wonder, like, you notice with modern English that it's almost like nouns are becoming verbs. Like I heard someone talk the other day, do you journal? Not do you write a diary or do you keep a journal? Do you journal? And you think, you know, I know what they mean, but would anyone else understand it? You know, speaking English as a foreign language.
I think English has some very, very specific challenges to it because it's such an international language. And it's very, very fluid, and it also has multiple centres. So both this country, but also Australia, and of course America. And it's also it's lost. It's not that it doesn't have a grammar. Of course, it has a grammar, but it's lost so many other things. I recently read a book about Old English. Right, Old English had a case system, and we jettisoned it sometime around the time of Chaucer. We combined it with French. And we seem to have sort of created this incredibly fluid language where nouns can become verbs and vice versa, and where conjugations are very limited. That makes it both, that puts a huge amount of weight onto syntax, right? So how you construct sentences, the order is vitally important in English. But the actual words themselves don't change much. So it makes it very easy for learners in one respect and very difficult in other respects. The other thing I've noticed is that you can, having taught a lot of foreign students, one of the places, Birkbeck College, I teach, the number one difficulty that you get from French and Chinese students is the word the, is the definite article, but in completely different ways. So you can always tell a French person because they use the word the on so much, right? In Britain, you don't study sociology. You study. I am studying sociology. In French, you say I am studying the sociology. Chinese people, though, Chinese has no definite articles, so everything they say sounds like something's missing the whole time. So, but you can argue that those things aren't mistakes so much as distinctive foreign language variants of English, right? That are only a problem when you try and write academic essays in English. The rest of the time, they are just quirks that actually you can quite enjoy. I quite like that French speakers, if they're not fluent English, can sound incredibly fastidious when they're speaking English because they use the definite article. And I actually enjoy that. I think it's great.
And final.
It comes naturally. I'm bilingual in French. And if you say, je parle bien le français ou le chinois, le comes in.
I know.
Because you can't do that.
I know. But part of the difficulty of learning languages is finding those little things that they're just ticks that just come automatically.
There's nothing wrong with it.
No, it's not a bad thing. It's just
a bolt-on that you can't do without.
Yeah.
the joys of language here. Yes. So let's wrap up. There are lots of questions I want to ask, but it's gone 9 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap it up there. But I first of all want to thank you, Keith, for a fascinating topic that starts in a very unlikely way, and actually throws light on not just linguistic diversity, but also historical diversity, particularly within Europe, in a way that I think is really eye-opening. But before we applaud Keith for his time this evening, just a couple of announcements, because we've got a run of, over the next 5-6 weeks, we've got a run of literary talks coming up. We have, in 2 weeks' time, on the 26th of September, Professor Vika Plock from the University of Exeter is speaking about Joyce's Ulysses, 100 years on. That was a talk that had to be cancelled in the summer, so I'm delighted that she can join us again. Then on the 3rd of October, so the week after that, Professor Adam Watt, also from Exeter, is speaking about Proust.
It's a French theme this evening.
It's a French theme. And then a couple of weeks after that, on the 22nd of October, we move away from Dublin and from France, and we think about Bath's Gothic fiction, a one-day symposium on the 22nd of October, a Saturday, with, I think, 5-6 speakers, including Sir Christopher Frayling, and a couple of my colleagues from Bath University and others. So we've got a great lineup of things to look forward to. But it's the start of our new academic year for the group, and I want to thank Keith for getting us off to a really kind of rich and fascinating start. So Keith, thank you so much.